He was a paralyzed billionaire who refused to speak. His mother told me he'd given up on life after the accident that took his ability to walk. But on my very first night as his live-in nurse, I found him in the dark, his body shaking with silent sobs as he clutched a hidden, tear-stained letter. I realized in that moment that his body wasn't the only thing that was broken. His heart was shattered too. Before we get into it, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments and be sure to subscribe for more new stories every day. Okay, let's go back to how I ended up there. 3 months before I walked into that silent, opulent mansion, I was supposed to be walking down the aisle. My own life had been a picture of quiet, happy certainty. I was a newly qualified physical therapist, and I was engaged to a man I had loved since college, a man I thought was the kindest, gentlest soul I had ever known. Our small apartment was filled with wedding gifts, my beautiful, simple wedding dress was hanging in my closet, and our future felt as bright and as certain as the morning sun. The end came not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. On the morning of our wedding, I woke up to find his side of the bed empty. On his pillow was a single, folded note. It wasn't a love letter. It was a coward's farewell. I can still recite the words by heart. "Sophie," it read, "I am so sorry to do this to you, but I can't go through with it. It's all too much, too fast. I need to find myself. Please, don't try to contact me. I wish you the best." Just like that, he was gone, and I was left with a canceled wedding, a mountain of non-refundable deposits I couldn't possibly pay, and a heart that had been shattered into a million tiny, unrecognizable pieces. The weeks that followed were a fog of shame and grief. I lost my job at the small clinic where I worked, unable to function. I was broke, heartbroken, and my life, which had been so full of promise, was now in ruins. It was during a late-night desperate scroll through online job boards that I saw the advertisement. It was cryptic and unusual, unlike any other physical therapy job I had ever seen. Discreet, highly qualified live-in therapist required for a private, high-profile client, it read. Excellent compensation package, must be willing to relocate immediately to a remote estate and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. It sounded like something out of a movie, but the salary they were offering was a lifeline I couldn't afford to ignore. I sent in my resume not expecting to hear back. To my surprise, I received a video interview the very next day. My interviewer was not the patient, but his mother, Eleanor Croft. She was a woman who radiated a cool, intimidating elegance, her voice as polished and as hard as the marble fireplace behind her. The interview was less a conversation and more an interrogation. She told me her son Julian, a man who had once been a vibrant and powerful CEO, had been in a tragic car accident 6 months prior that had left him paralyzed from the waist down. "The physical injury is only half the battle, Miss Peters," she had said, her eyes cold and analytical. "The accident, it broke his spirit. He has given up on life. He is difficult, he is bitter, and he refuses to engage with any of his previous therapists. He will likely be cruel to you." She had paused, her gaze intense. "Do you believe you have the fortitude to handle that?" I thought of my own broken spirit, of the cruelty I had just endured. "Yes, Mrs. Croft," I had said, my voice quiet but firm. "I believe I do." I got the job. A week later, I had packed my entire life into 2 suitcases and was standing at the grand, imposing entrance of the Croft family's remote coastal estate. The house was magnificent, a modern marvel of glass and stone overlooking the ocean, but it felt cold, silent, and deeply, profoundly sad. Eleanor greeted me at the door. She laid out the rules with a chilling, clinical precision. "You are here for his physical therapy, and nothing more," she had stated. "You will not engage with him about his emotional state. You will not ask him about his life before the accident. That part of his life is a closed book. We have removed anything from the house that might upset him or remind him of what he has lost. Your job is to focus on his muscles, not his moods. Am I perfectly clear?" "Crystal clear," I had replied. My first meeting with Julian was later that afternoon in the mansion's vast, state-of-the-art therapy room. He was sitting in his wheelchair, his back to me, staring out a massive picture window at the gray, churning ocean. He was a silhouette, a man defined by his loss. He was younger than I had expected, maybe only a few years older than me. "Mr. Croft?" I had said softly. "My name is Sophie. I'm your new physical therapist." He did not turn. He did not speak. He just continued to stare out at the waves. The silence was not empty. It was hostile, a wall of grief and rage so thick I could almost feel it. His mother had told me he was broken, but as I stood there in the heavy, oppressive silence of that room, I realized broken wasn't the right word. This man was a fortress. His walls were a mile high, and I had no idea if they were there to keep the world out or to keep a terrible, all-consuming sadness locked deep inside. My first week at the Croft estate was a masterclass in silent warfare. The mansion was a beautiful, echoing prison, and Julian Croft was its sole, hostile inmate. He was not just a patient, he was a fortress of silent, bitter rage, and every single therapy session was a battle against his formidable walls. My life settled into a grueling, lonely routine. I would wake in my sterile, impersonal guest suite, the only sound the distant, mournful cry of seagulls over the ocean. I would spend my days in the state-of-the-art therapy room, a space filled with the best equipment money could buy, trying to coax a single, voluntary muscle twitch from a man who seemed to have made a conscious decision to let his body waste away. He was a master of nonverbal cruelty. He would not speak to me, not a single word, but his eyes, a deep, intelligent blue that were now clouded with a profound, stormy grief, would follow my every move with a look of cold, burning contempt. When I would try to stretch his atrophied leg muscles, his body would remain a dead, uncooperative weight. When I would speak to him, explaining the purpose of each exercise in a calm, professional tone, he would just turn his head and stare out the massive window at the churning sea, as if I were nothing more than a buzzing fly in the room. Some days, he would deliberately knock a glass of water from my hand with a flick of his wrist, his eyes daring me to react, to quit, to break. I did none of those things. My own heartbreak, still so fresh and so raw, was my secret shield. I had already been broken by the silent, cowardly departure of the man I loved. The active, hostile silence of this man, this stranger, was a language I could, in a strange way, understand. I recognized the deep, profound pain that was fueling his rage, and so I endured. I would clean up the spilled water without comment. I would continue my one-sided conversations about nerve regeneration and muscle memory. It was my job, the job I so desperately needed.
But it was also more than that. It was a silent promise I made to the broken man in the wheelchair. "I am not afraid of your pain," I was trying to say. "I will not abandon you." His mother, Eleanor, was a constant disembodied presence. She would call me every evening for a progress report. Her questions were always the same, her voice a sharp, clinical instrument. "Has he spoken yet, Miss Peters? Has he shown any voluntary movement? Are you following the dietary plan I laid out?" She never asked how I was. She never asked about her son's emotional state. Her concern was purely for the physical, for the restoration of the broken family heir. During my off hours, I would wander the silent, echoing halls of the mansion. It was a beautiful, but deeply strange place. It was a house with no history. The bookshelves in the grand library were filled with antique, leather-bound books that had clearly never been opened. The walls were adorned with expensive, abstract, modern art, the kind of pieces an interior decorator chooses to match a color scheme. There were no personal photographs, no cluttered desks, no signs of a life ever having been lived here. It was the home of a man and a family who had deliberately and meticulously erased their own past. It was during one of these lonely explorations that I found the first clue. In a small, rarely used guest bedroom, tucked away at the bottom of a linen closet, I found a single, forgotten photo album that had clearly been missed in the Great Purge. The pictures were of a younger Julian, a Julian I did not recognize. He was smiling, his face full of a light and a joy that seemed impossible now. He was on a sailboat, he was hiking a mountain, he was laughing with friends. And in almost every picture, he was with a beautiful, vibrant, red-haired woman. They were a portrait of pure, uncomplicated happiness. On the last page of the album, there was a single professional engagement photo. Underneath, a date was written in neat, feminine script. A date that was just 2 weeks after his accident. There was a name, too. Amelia. So there had been someone important. Someone who had been so completely and totally erased from this house that it was as if she had never existed. The mystery of Julian's profound, all-consuming grief began to sharpen into a new, more painful focus. That night, my first Friday at the estate, I was doing a final, quiet check of the house before heading to my own room. The halls were dark, the only light the pale, silvery glow of the moon streaming through the massive windows. As I passed Julian's room, I noticed the door was ajar. I was about to close it when I heard a sound from within that made me freeze. It was a sound so quiet, so full of a pain so profound, that it was almost not a sound at all. It was the sound of a man trying and failing to choke back a sob. My professional duty, the rules Eleanor had so clearly laid out for me, told me to walk away, to respect his privacy. But my own heart, the heart that still ached with the fresh memory of my own silent, lonely tears, would not let me. I pushed the door open just a crack, my own heart pounding in my chest. And what I saw in the moonlit room was not a bitter, angry billionaire wallowing in self-pity. It was a man drowning in a grief so profound, so naked, and so familiar that it felt like I was looking in a mirror. He was in his wheelchair by the window, his back to me, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs, and in his hand, clutched with a white-knuckled grip, was a single, worn and tear-stained letter. The story of his broken spirit, I knew with a sudden, absolute certainty, was not in his legs. It was in that piece of paper. I stood in the darkened doorway of Julian's room, my body frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The sound of his choked, silent sob was a magnet, pulling me forward against all of my professional training, against the cold, clear instructions of his mother. I was supposed to be his physical therapist. I was supposed to be a detached professional. But I was also a woman whose own heart was a fresh, open wound. And the sound of his grief was a language my soul understood with a terrible, instinctual clarity. I pushed the door open a little further and stepped inside. The room was vast and beautiful, with a wall of glass that looked out onto the dark, churning expanse of the ocean, the moonlight painting a shimmering, silver path on the waves. He was in his wheelchair, not in bed, his back to me, his shoulders shaking with the force of the grief he was trying so desperately to suppress. The worn, tear-stained letter was clutched in his right hand. He must have heard me, a subtle shift in the air, because his body went rigid. He quickly, clumsily tried to shove the letter into the pocket of his robe, his face hardening into the familiar, hostile mask he wore like a suit of armor. "Get out!" he hissed, his voice a low, ragged thing. He didn't turn to look at me. "I don't need a babysitter. Get out!" The old Sophie, the one from 3 months ago, would have fled. She would have stammered an apology and retreated, cowed by his anger. But I was not that woman anymore.
Heartbreak had burned away my fear of confrontation. I had already lost everything. What more was there to be afraid of? I didn't leave. Instead, I walked slowly, quietly into the room and stood a few feet behind him. "It hurts, doesn't it?" I said, my voice a soft, quiet thing in the cavernous room. He flinched as if I had struck him. "You don't know anything about it," he snarled, his head still turned towards the window. "No, I don't know about the accident," I said, my voice still gentle. "I don't know what it's like to be in this chair, but I know what that is." I nodded towards the pocket where he had hidden the letter. "I know what it feels like to hold a piece of paper that contains the end of your entire world. I know what it feels like to have the person you thought you would spend the rest of your life with, the person who was your entire future, decide that you are not worth the effort." He was silent. The hostile energy coming off him began to waver, replaced with a tense, listening stillness. I took a deep breath, and I told him my own secret, the one I had not spoken aloud to another living soul. 3 months ago, on the morning of my wedding, my fiancé left me. He didn't even have the courage to do it in person. He left a note, a short, simple, devastating note on his pillow. He said he needed to find himself. He said it was all too much. What he really meant was that I was too much. I could feel my own tears beginning to well up, but I pushed them down. "So, you're right," I said, my voice shaking only slightly. "I don't know your pain, but I know pain. I know what it is to be broken. And what you're feeling right now, it is not something you can just ignore. It is not something you can hide from." He was silent for a long, long time. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves on the shore below. Finally, slowly, he turned his wheelchair to face me. His eyes, in the pale moonlight, were red-rimmed and full of a grief so profound, so raw, that it was like looking into my own soul. The mask was gone. In its place was just a man, a young, heartbroken man. He slowly, reluctantly, pulled the crumpled letter from his pocket. "Her name was Amelia," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We were supposed to be married last spring." And then he told me everything. He spoke of a life that had been so completely and totally erased from this house, a life full of love and laughter and plans. He spoke of the accident, a drunk driver who had run a red light, the terrifying squeal of tires, the sudden, violent darkness. He spoke of waking up in a hospital, the sterile white ceiling, the doctor's grave face, the moment he had tried to move his legs and had felt nothing. "But that wasn't the worst part," he said, his eyes now fixed on the letter in his hands. "The worst part came a week later." He told me how the letter had arrived, how he had seen her beautiful, familiar handwriting on the envelope and had felt a surge of hope, believing it was a promise to stand by him, a declaration of her love. He unfolded the worn piece of paper, his hands trembling. He didn't need to read it. He knew it by heart. But he spoke the words aloud to me, a painful, necessary exorcism. "My dearest Julian," he recited, his voice a monotone of remembered pain, "I will always love the man you were, the man who sailed with me, who climbed mountains with me. But I cannot be the woman who spends the rest of her life pushing a wheelchair. I am not strong enough for that. This is not the life I signed up for. Please try to understand. I have to let you go. Goodbye, Amelia." He finished, his breath a ragged, shuddering thing. "The man I was," he whispered, the words full of a self-loathing that was almost unbearable. "She loved a man who could walk, and that man was gone." He then told me what his mother, Eleanor, had done. In her own misguided, controlling way,
She had tried to protect him. She had found him in his hospital room, destroyed by the letter, and she had taken it. She had then systematically purged his life of every trace of Amelia, every photograph, every gift, every memory. She had forbidden the staff, the doctors, his own friends from ever speaking Amelia's name again. "You must forget her," his mother had commanded. "Your future is about your recovery, not about the past." She thought if I couldn't see her, if I couldn't hear her name, that I would forget her. But all she did was trap me in a silent room with Amelia's ghost. I couldn't grieve. I couldn't heal. There was just this. He gestured around the vast, empty, and beautiful room. I finally understood. The anger, the bitterness, the silent, hostile rage. It wasn't about the chair. It was about the letter. It was about the heartbreak. He had been drowning in a grief his own family had refused to acknowledge. A new, unspoken contract was signed between us in that moonlit room. I was not just his physical therapist anymore. I had been hired to heal his body. But I knew now that my real job, the far more difficult and far more important job, was to help him heal his broken heart. And in doing so, I had the strange, terrifying, and hopeful feeling that I might just be able to find a way to start mending my own. The confession in the moonlit room changed everything. The wall of hostile silence between Julian and I had been replaced by a fragile but profound bridge of shared understanding. We were no longer just a patient and a therapist. We were two survivors of a very specific, very cruel kind of shipwreck, and we had found each other on a deserted island. I left his room that night knowing that the next day, the quiet, cold war I had been fighting against his despair was over. A new, much more dangerous war was about to begin.
The next morning, the atmosphere in the therapy room was electric with a new, unspoken purpose. Julian was not just a passive participant anymore. He was my ally. He met my eyes with a look of grim determination. The physical work was still grueling, but now it was imbued with a new meaning. Every painful stretch, every difficult exercise was not just a step towards physical recovery. It was an act of rebellion against the emotional prison his family had built for him. Our conversations changed. We no longer spoke of my past. We spoke of his. I became his confidant, the first and only person to whom he could speak the name Amelia aloud. He told me about her fiery red hair, her infectious laugh, about their shared dream of sailing around the world. And as he spoke, I could see the man he had been before the accident, the man his mother had tried so hard to erase, slowly, painfully begin to reemerge. I knew, and he knew, that this fragile piece could not last. We were living on borrowed time in a bubble of truth that was bound to be burst by the arrival of his mother, Eleanor. The confrontation was inevitable. We decided it would be on our terms. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. We were in the middle of a session when Eleanor swept into the therapy room, her face a mask of cool maternal authority. She was carrying a small silver tray with a cup of herbal tea on it. "I thought you might need a break, Julian, dear," she said, her voice a symphony of condescending concern. "Sophie, you must be careful not to overexert him. His recovery is a marathon, not a sprint." Julian, who was in the middle of a difficult transfer from his chair to the parallel bars, paused. He looked at me, a silent, almost imperceptible nod. "It's time." "Thank you, Mother," he said, his voice calm, but with a new hard edge she had never heard before. "But I won't be needing the tea. There is something else we need to discuss." Eleanor's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, and what might that be?" Julian took a deep, steadying breath. "We need to talk about Amelia," he said. The name landed in the sterile, quiet room with the force of a physical blow. Eleanor froze, the silver tray rattling slightly in her hands. The color drained from her face. "I have told you," she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "We do not speak that name in this house. That woman is the past. She is irrelevant. Your focus needs to be on your future. How can I have a future when you have forbidden me from grieving my past? You didn't just hide her letters, Mother. You tried to erase her. You tried to erase me, the man who loved her. I did it to protect you, she cried, her voice now shrill with a desperate, self-righteous indignation. She abandoned you. She was a weak, shallow girl who could not handle adversity. She left you when you were at your lowest. I removed a source of pain from your life. I did it out of love. You call that love? Julian's laugh was a short, bitter, and heartbreaking sound. You call silencing my grief, denying my heartbreak, and treating me like a fragile child who can't handle the truth, love? You were not protecting me. You were controlling me. You were trying to manage my recovery, to mold my grief into something neat and quiet and convenient for you. He then did something I had not expected. With the strength I didn't know he possessed, he pushed himself up on the parallel bars, his arms shaking with the sheer monumental effort. He was supporting his own weight. He was standing. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock.
"The reason I have been in this chair, Mother," he said, his voice a raw, ragged thing. "The reason I had given up on life was not because of my legs. It was because of my heart. It was because the woman I loved told me I was a broken man, and my own mother, the person who was supposed to help me heal, decided to agree with her by hiding the evidence. You didn't just hide a letter. You hid the most important part of my story. You left me alone in the dark with a ghost." He looked at me then, his eyes full of a profound and deeply moving gratitude. "Sophie," he said, his voice softening, "she didn't run from my pain. She saw it. She acknowledged it. She shared her own. She is the one who has been healing me, not you." The words were a final, devastating blow. Eleanor stared at me, her face a ruin of shock, jealousy, and a dawning, horrified understanding. She was seeing me not as an employee, but as a rival, as the one who had succeeded where she had so spectacularly failed. The fortress of her control, the one she had so carefully constructed around her son, had been breached, and I, the quiet, heartbroken woman she had hired, was the one who had just handed her son the key. Without another word, she placed the silver tray on a nearby table, turned, and walked out of the room, her proud, rigid posture the only thing she had left. The door closed behind her, leaving Julian, me, and the raw, painful, and finally spoken truth behind in the quiet, sunlit room. The battle was over. The hard work of healing could now truly begin. In the deafening silence that followed my mother-in-law Eleanor's departure from the therapy room, Julian remained standing, his arms trembling with the sheer, monumental effort. He was not just supporting his own physical weight on the parallel bars, he was supporting the weight of a lifetime of unspoken grief, a burden he had finally, bravely chosen to confront. After a long, shuddering moment, his strength gave out, and he sagged back into my arms. I carefully, gently helped him back into the safety of his wheelchair. He was utterly and completely exhausted. But as I looked at his face, I saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. The cold, hard wall of his bitterness was gone. In its place was a flicker, a tiny, fragile, and infinitely precious flicker of hope. The confrontation with his mother was the earthquake that shattered the foundations of their family dynamic. Eleanor, for the first time, had been stripped of her power, her misguided attempts at protection exposed as the controlling, silencing force they truly were. She did not apologize, not in words. Her pride was too deeply entrenched for that. But her actions changed. She retreated. She stopped her daily inspections of our therapy sessions. She stopped her constant hovering presence. She gave her son, for the first time since his accident, the one thing he so desperately needed: space. And in that space, we began the real work. Our days settled into a new rhythm. one of intense, focused, and collaborative effort. The therapy room was no longer a battlefield. It was our sanctuary. The physical work was grueling. There were days filled with frustration, with setbacks, with pain so intense it brought tears to his eyes. But there was no more rage. He was no longer fighting me. He was fighting for himself. And I was there, at his side, for every small, agonizing, and triumphant victory. I will never forget the day, 3 months in, when he was working on his leg exercises, and I saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in the big toe of his left foot. He hadn't felt it. "Julian," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "Do that again." He had focused, his brow furrowed with concentration, and it had happened again.
A small, voluntary movement. We had both just stared at his foot, and then we had looked at each other, and for the first time, a real, genuine, and beautiful laugh had escaped his lips. It was the sound of a door, long since rusted shut, creaking open. But the physical healing was only half the story. The true healing happened in the quiet hours after the therapy was done. We would sit on the grand, empty terrace overlooking the ocean, wrapped in blankets against the cool sea breeze, and we would talk. He told me more about Amelia, not with the raw, agonizing grief from that first night, but with a quiet, sad nostalgia. He spoke of their love, but he also, for the first time, began to see its flaws. Her love for the powerful, globe-trotting CEO, and her fear of the broken, vulnerable man. And I, in turn, told him about my own heartbreak. I told him about my ex-fiancé, about the note on the pillow, about the quiet, creeping feeling I'd had for years that he had loved the idea of me, the quiet, supportive, uncomplicated partner, more than the real, complex person I was. In sharing our stories, in laying our broken hearts bare, we discovered a profound and unexpected kinship. We were two members of the same sad, secret club, and in understanding each other's pain, we began to heal our own. One evening I found him in the library, a room he had always avoided. He had a large cardboard box on his lap. It was filled with the photo albums and mementos of his life with Amelia, the ones his mother had hidden away. We went through them together, one by one. He told me the story behind each photograph, and when we were done, he had closed the box. "Thank you," he had said, his voice quiet but steady. I think I can finally put this away now." It was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of acceptance. My own moment of closure came in the form of an email. My ex-fiancé, after a year of complete silence, had written to me. It was a long, rambling message full of apologies, of regrets, of how he had made a terrible mistake. A year ago, that email would have been a lifeline. Now, as I read his words, I felt nothing. The man who had written it was a stranger, a ghost from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The pain was gone. I deleted the email without a reply. It was on the 1-year anniversary of my arrival at the estate that we found ourselves on the cliffside path that overlooked the churning ocean. The path was uneven, a challenge for anyone. Julian was not in his wheelchair. He stood beside me, his body supported by 2 sleek carbon fiber crutches, his legs encased in modern supportive braces. He was standing on his own 2 feet. "A year ago," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder as he looked out at the horizon, "it felt like it was on another planet, a place I would never, ever reach again." He turned to me, his eyes now so clear and so full of life, meeting mine. "Thank you, Sophie." he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was more than just gratitude. "You didn't just teach me how to walk again. You taught me how to live again." I looked at him, at this strong, resilient, and beautiful man who had fought his way back from the deepest, darkest abyss. I thought of the heartbroken, jilted woman who had arrived at his door a year ago, my own life in ruins. My vindication was not in a moment of revenge. It was not in proving my ex-fiancé wrong. It was in this quiet, powerful moment of shared triumph. We had taken the shattered pieces of our own broken hearts, and we had together used them to mend each other.
"I think," he said, a slow, tentative smile spreading across his face, "that it's time for me to learn how to take a woman out on a proper date again." He looked at me, his gaze full of a new, hopeful question. And I was wondering if my physical therapist might be free this Friday night. And as I looked back at him, I realized my own healing was also complete. I smiled, a real, genuine, and incandescently happy smile. "I would love that," I said. "I would love that very much." An absolutely beautiful and moving story about how the deepest heartbreaks can sometimes lead to the most profound healing. What do you think the future holds for Sophie and Julian? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were touched by this incredible story of rebuilding trust, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more powerful and emotional stories every day. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.